February 28, 2026, the US and Israel shattered the status quo with a massive coordinated assault, Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion, that obliterated Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei inside his Tehran compound, along with dozens of top regime and military chiefs. Iran retaliated instantly with Operation True Promise 4, unleashing hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones on Israel, US bases, and Gulf oil infrastructure. 1 week on, the Allies have hammered hundreds of targets across 26 of Iran's 31 provinces in non-stop air dominance. This geography-defying war, separated by 1,000-plus kilometers of hostile skies, mountains, and choke points, relies on long-range strikes, proxy forces, and total air control to deliver regime change, nuclear destruction, missile annihilation, and the collapse of the axis of resistance. The cost is staggering. America burned $3.7 billion in the first 100 hours, $891 million per day, $3.5 billion unbudgeted. Iran's death toll is surging every day, including horrific mass casualty strikes like the school hit next to an IRGC base in Manab. Israel and Iran share no land border, forcing the conflict to rely heavily on air power, ballistic missiles, and control of sovereign airspace. To reach deep targets in Iran, Israeli and American strike packages must cross the airspaces of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Syria. This geography has turned the entire Middle Eastern sky into a combat zone, creating major logistical problems for both military operations and global civilian aviation. To project sustained military power deep into the Iranian interior, despite vast distances, the United States relies on a dispersed network of bases across the Persian Gulf, the Levant, and the Horn of Africa. Yet their proximity to the Iranian coastline makes these assets highly vulnerable to Iran's asymmetric retaliation. Tehran deliberately targets the host nations to fracture the U.S. alliance network, imposing intolerable security and economic costs on Gulf Cooperation Council (GCC) states to force a halt to hostilities. Although extensive, the U.S. military footprint remains strategically brittle due to this geographical exposure. The Iranian retaliatory campaign at the heart of Operation True Promise 4 has launched hundreds of ballistic missiles and Shahed series one-way attack drones to saturate the GCC nations' relatively weaker air defenses, unlike Israel's highly integrated systems. The strikes have caused major disruptions, including the deaths of 6 U.S. soldiers in a command center in Kuwait and the suspension of standard visa and immigration operations across Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar. To sustain strategic bomber operations in Operation Epic Fury over the vast distances to Iran, the United States secured UK permission to use British overseas territories. Heavy bombers, B-1 and B-2, now operate from RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire and the remote atoll of Diego Garcia in the British Indian Ocean Territory, bypassing congested and vulnerable Persian Gulf bases. This immediately expanded the war's geographical scope. On March 2, 2026, Iranian-manufactured drones struck the runway at RAF Akrotiri, a British sovereign base area in Cyprus, the first direct attack on a European sovereign base in the conflict. The strike demonstrated Iran's ability to project power into the eastern Mediterranean. The UK Ministry of Defense confirmed no casualties, implemented precautionary dispersal of non-essential personnel, and temporarily evacuated Paphos Regional Airport. The inclusion of British territories in the target set has triggered major legal and diplomatic consequences. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer justified the basing as collective self-defense to protect regional allies from Iranian missiles. The international legal community regards this claim as unrealistic in an active war zone. The UN Secretary General stated that the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran violate the prohibition on the use of force, a position endorsed by Spain, France, and Canada, further isolating the United States and the United Kingdom diplomatically. While horizontal distance shapes how munitions are delivered, vertical topography and subsurface geology determine their ultimate effectiveness. Iran's defense strategy relies heavily on its rugged physical geography. The Zagros Mountains to the west and Alborz Mountains to the north form natural barriers that shield the Iranian heartland. This terrain is the foundation of Iran's Mosaic Doctrine, a hybrid military strategy developed during the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War. The doctrine stresses extreme dispersion, operational endurance, and layered resistance. It employs decentralized command structures and the mountainous interior to conceal ballistic missile silos, naval assets, and deeply buried nuclear infrastructure. The primary U.S.-Israeli goal of permanently dismantling Iran's nuclear enrichment and weaponization capabilities is fundamentally undermined by subsurface geology. The effectiveness of heavy earth-penetrating munitions, such as the U.S. Air Force's 30,000-pound GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, MOP, depends not only on the weapon's design, but on the specific rock type protecting the target. The 2026 conflict has proven that, in modern aerial warfare, the strongest defense is the stone itself. The earlier destruction of the softer alluvial Natanz site forced Iran to accelerate construction of the Koh-e-Kolang Gaz La Pickaxe Mountain complex. Buried far deeper than Fordow and shielded by the immense mass of Zagros Peak, the facility survived initial strikes. Satellite imagery later showed Iran rapidly sealing tunnel portals with concrete sarcophagi and thick layers of cement, soil, and rock, rendering standard bunker busters ineffective. At the Esfahan mountain complex, Iran added cruise missile chicane barriers, thick offset protective walls designed to absorb and deflect missiles aimed at tunnel entrances. As a result, achieving nuclear dismantlement now demands an unsustainable volume of continuous high-yield precision strikes, turning the campaign into a grueling war of attrition rather than a decisive surgical victory. Iran has historically defended its vast mountainous airspace with a robust integrated air defense system distributed across its interior. After severe degradation of these systems in mid-2024 and 2025, Tehran rapidly reconstituted its perimeter defenses just days before the 2026 war outbreak. High-resolution satellite imagery from Planet Labs and Airbus revealed the redeployment of S-300 surface-to-air missile launchers, 5P-85 series, to prepared revetments in Kharizak and Kavar Shar, near Tehran. Analysts identified a critical radar gap. The Associated Fire Control and Acquisition radars, 30N6E1 engagement and 64N6E acquisition, were entirely absent from visible earthworks. This indicates Iran is leveraging its topography to hide these sensors in hardened underground shelters, in the hole, minimizing exposure and electronic signatures. The radars are deployed only during active target acquisition to avoid preemptive SEAD strikes. Alternatively, Tehran may be remotely integrating the Russian launchers with indigenous Iranian radars from the Bavar 373 or Khordad 15 systems. More concerning is potential linkage to the advanced Gadir over-the-horizon early warning radars. Developed domestically by the IRGC Aerospace Force, the phased array Gadir radar has a claimed detection range of 1,100 kilometers for ballistic missiles and 600 kilometers for aircraft. New construction sites have been identified in the mountainous northwest near Tabriz and along the Persian Gulf coast, enabling detection of incoming strike aircraft long before they cross Iran's borders. This geographically dispersed hybrid layered defense architecture creates severe operational friction for the U.S.-Israeli air campaign, forcing the expenditure of vast quantities of interceptors and precision munitions, such as Tomahawk land attack missiles, TLAMs, to secure temporary air corridors. For decades, Iran bypassed the geographical constraints of its borders by establishing an uninterrupted terrestrial corridor known as the Land Bridge. Spanning 1,574 kilometers from the Zagros Mountains through Iraq's fertile plains, along Syria's Euphrates River Valley via the border town of Abu Kamal and terminating at Lebanon's Mediterranean coast. This route was the physical embodiment of Tehran's grand strategy. It enabled the IRGC's elite Quds force to funnel weapons, personnel, and logistical support directly to Hezbollah and other allied Shiite militias, allowing Iran to project power onto Israel's borders without exposing its homeland. The collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria on December 8, 2024, shattered the geographical viability of Iran's land bridge. Syria had served not only as a transit route, but as the vital logistical hub and manufacturing base for the axis of resistance. Iran used facilities such as the Scientific Studies and Research Center, CERS, to produce precision-guided munitions locally for Hezbollah, eliminating the need for long-haul transport. The fall of the regime and rebel seizure of Damascus completely severed the territorial link between Tehran and Beirut, delivering a major blow to Iran's irregular warfare capabilities. By the outbreak of the 2026 war, this geopolitical shift left Hezbollah geographically isolated and logistically starved. Iran was forced to abandon secure land routes and rely instead on vulnerable airlifts and maritime smuggling across the Mediterranean, which Israel easily intercepted. Israel exploited this isolation during its 2024 campaigns, using absolute air superiority to destroy Hezbollah's remaining arsenals in southern Lebanon. The IDF decimated the group's military infrastructure, assassinated nearly all senior commanders, and eliminated an estimated 45% of its fighting force. Deprived of terrestrial resupply, Hezbollah lost its ability to open a sustained northern ground front against Israel, a cornerstone of Iran's deterrent strategy. It has instead withdrawn from the border and shifted to long-range rocket and drone attacks from central and northern Lebanon, such as strikes on the IDF Mishmar al-Carmel missile defense site in Haifa. The collapse of the land bridge transformed the Levant from a theater of contiguous ground threats into an arena defined by aerial interception and long-range attrition. Denied land access through the Levant and facing overwhelming Allied air superiority over its homeland, Iran's geographical leverage has shifted almost entirely to the maritime domain. The Middle East is defined by two critical choke points, the Strait of Hormuz to the east and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to the west. Control or disruption of these narrow passages gives Iran and its proxies a unique asymmetrical edge, holding global commerce and energy markets hostage, weaponizing geography to inflict severe economic costs on the U.S. and its regional allies. The Strait of Hormuz handles approximately 20% of global oil trade, 8 to 10 million barrels per day of crude, and approximately 20% of LNG trade. Iran leverages its northern Persian Gulf position to project power, seizing commercial vessels to showcase A2AD capabilities, like the recent IRGC fastboat diversion of the Marshall Islands-flagged tanker Talara, carrying 30,000 tons of petrochemicals into Iranian waters. Tehran has warned it could fully close the strait if its oil exports face international blocks. Yet this creates a stark strategic paradox. Iran's economy depends on the same waters, with approximately 90% of exports via Karg Island Terminal, 15 miles offshore. Unlike Saudi Arabia or UAE, which have partial overland pipeline alternatives to the Red Sea or Gulf of Oman, Iran lacks viable land routes. Its key fields, Avaz, Marun, West Karun, and Khuzestan, rely entirely on Karg. Thus, closing the strait or risking U.S. retaliation on Karg would instantly gut Iran's hydrocarbon revenues. This mutual vulnerability forces precise calibration. Rather than the full closure, Iran targets neighbors' infrastructure, striking Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura facility and Qatar's Ras Laffan city to ignite global energy volatility and supply shock fears, without dooming its own terminals. Consultancies like Bourse and Bazaar warn that a mere 50% drop in Hormuz maritime capacity could trigger Gulf-wide shortages of food and essentials within 20 days. To bypass vulnerabilities in the Persian Gulf, Iran has invested heavily over the past decade in the Red Sea basin. By arming, training, and funding Yemen's Houthi movement, Iran secured a proxy grip on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a choke point carrying 10 to 12% of global maritime trade and about 9 million barrels of crude oil daily. The Houthi maritime campaign unfolded in 5 geographical phases, starting with Israel-linked ships, then expanding to US and UK-linked vessels, and finally targeting any ship whose parent company traded with Israeli ports. This sustained effort created a lasting dual-route equilibrium, upending global shipping. Major container lines like AP Moller-Maersk now avoid the Red Sea, rerouting around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. These detours add 6,000 to 11,000 nautical miles to Asia-Europe voyages, lengthening transit times by up to 14 days and raising fuel costs by up to $1 million per trip. Acting as both Iranian proxy and independent territorial force, the Houthis demonstrate how a non-state actor can exploit strategic coastal geography to hold key segments of world commerce hostage. As the 2026 U.S.-Israel war intensifies and Western naval patrols saturate the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, intelligence reveals Iran's maritime strategy expanding into the Horn of Africa. To secure staging grounds beyond the monitored, often bombed Yemeni coast, Iran has revived ties with Eritrea, gaining operational access to the deep-water ports of Assab and Massawa. Early 2026 satellite imagery confirms clandestine landings of heavy-lift cargo aircraft at these sites, via routes used by sanctioned Iranian entities. Key examples include Belarusian Ilyushin 62 freighters and Boeing 747-281F planes operated by U.S. Treasury-sanctioned FARS Air Keshem for weapons proliferation. These aircraft, with vast holds, transport disassembled drones, precision munitions, spare parts, and IRGC technical advisors to activate them. This Western Red Sea foothold establishes a secondary, cross-strait base that hinders U.S. naval targeting and enables synchronized swarm attacks alongside Houthi forces. The pivot circumvents Allied blockades in the Gulf of Aden while injecting Iranian asymmetric warfare into Eritrea, upending local security dynamics, posing a national security crisis for Ethiopia, and risking wider proxy wars across the volatile Horn of Africa. Operation Epic Fury depends almost entirely on air supremacy and standoff naval strikes. Yet, the Middle East's physical geography and early 2020s political shifts make a conventional U.S. ground invasion of Iran unfeasible. Iran's vast expanse, over 1.74 million square kilometers, home to nearly 92 million people, and encircled by rugged mountains, renders rapid, sustainable occupation logistically untenable. Moreover, realignments in the early 2020s eroded the essential land-based infrastructure needed to launch such an assault. At the global war on terror's peak, U.S. military planners commanded a vast, contiguous operational footprint along Iran's borders. By 2026, this infrastructure has vanished entirely. The Eastern Wedge crumbled on August 30th, 2021, with the full U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, eliminating extensive airfields, logistics networks, and ground forces on Iran's eastern border. Likewise, the Western Hinge dissolved after the September 2024 bilateral agreement that terminated the U.S.-led coalition mission in federal Iraq by late 2025. Lacking contiguous Allied territory for staging large-scale mechanized infantry, armor, and artillery deployments, the geometry of force density breaks down. A 2026 conventional U.S. ground invasion would hinge on an amphibious assault from the Persian Gulf or Gulf of Oman, a maneuver deemed highly risky and potentially disastrous by defense analysts, facing Iran's layered coastal defenses of anti-ship missiles, naval mines, and drone swarms. To offset the logistical barriers to deploying U.S. ground forces, the Allied coalition is exploiting Iran's internal ethnic and geographical fault lines. Leveraging the rugged, hard-to-police Zagros Mountains, Kurdish militias have launched a major ground offensive from Iraq's semi-autonomous Kurdish region straight into western Iran. This assault involves thousands of heavily armed, battle-hardened fighters from groups like the Kurdistan Freedom Party, PAK, coordinated tacitly with the Kurdistan Democratic Party, KDP, and Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, PUK. Bolstered by President Donald Trump's rhetoric and alleged Allied air cover plus logistical aid, these forces aim to seize and hold territory, shattering the regime's grip on its western borderlands. The Kurds, honed by years battling the Islamic State, form the Iranian opposition's most skilled contingent. Iran countered this border incursion with ferocious force, unleashing preemptive artillery barrages and deploying the IRGC ground forces Sabrin's Special Forces Brigade. On March 3, 2026, the IRGC mandated the full evacuation of the Kurdish-majority border city of Marwan, foreshadowing a ruthless scorched earth counterinsurgency. This clash underscores a key U.S.-Israeli geographical tactic, peripheral destabilization. By sparking armed revolts along Iran's mountainous fringes, the coalition compels the IRGC to disperse its internal security forces across expansive, defiant zones, draining resources from the strategic heartland and substituting for a direct American ground invasion. The 2026 war's geographical imperatives ripple far beyond the Middle East, disrupting the global security architecture. By compelling the U.S. to intercept hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones across the vast airspace of the Persian Gulf and Levant, Iran has launched a war of attrition on American air defense stockpiles. This swift depletion of advanced interceptors has prompted the Department of Defense to redirect critical naval and air defense assets from Indo-Pacific Command to Central Command. The resulting pivot exposes vulnerabilities in the Pacific, advantaging rivals like China and North Korea, whose ballistic missile arsenals are proliferating, as they scrutinize the constraints of U.S.-layered defenses. Thus, the Iran conflict functions as a strategic sinkhole, siphoning American resources from core geostrategic theaters and illustrating how a regional standoff war, governed by the physics of long-range engagement, can upend the global balance of power.